So welcome everyone to this meeting of the APPG for the East of England. I'm Peter Aldous, co-chair of the APPG, along with my colleague Daniel Zeichner. I'll just quickly give a few sort of joining instructions. And first of all, we've got some very good speakers. There'll be an opportunity for everyone to then get involved in a Q&A session afterwards. When you're not speaking, when you're listening to people, keep on mute. If you, in the Q&A session, if you wish to make an issue, raise an issue, make a comment, ask a question, wave your virtual hand. If that's a challenge, wave your real hand frantically, and hopefully we'll be able to pick it up. There is a chat facility. Please use that. It's very good actually for sharing articles and reports, etc. And the meeting is being recorded for the simple reasons of note taking, and also quite often we do follow up our meeting with correspondence, with letters to ministers reporting what we're doing and requesting action on behalf of the East of England. And so that does very much facilitate that. And obviously then the recording, when that work has been done, is deleted. So welcome everyone. I will now hand over to Daniel to very much set the scene on our topic today and to make the necessary introductions to our speakers. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, and good morning, everybody. You will know the subject of today is simplifying central government funding and increasing freedom to generate revenue in order for local authorities to be partners in addressing the cost of living crisis, net zero and levelling up agendas. Well, certainly simplifying central government funding, I think would be a joy to all of us. Those of us that have either been councillors in the past or councillors at the moment will know that local government funding is one of those subjects which takes quite a long time to get to grips with, and I think we could all agree that simplification would be welcome. We have two excellent papers which I hope some of you will have had the opportunity to look at, and certainly when I was reading through them it reminded me from my time as a councillor, realising some of these issues are not new, although I have to say particularly the bidding culture and the short-term nature of that, and the resources that councils have to allocate to that process, I think is a source of huge frustration, and one that I hear points made to me about almost every time I talk to anyone involved in local government. So there's clearly an issue here. Now we have some expert speakers to guide us through this. Tony Travers, who'll be familiar to most of you, is I think slightly delayed joining us. So we're going to switch the sequence of speakers around.
I am joining.
Oh, Tony, you are here.
I am.
Brilliant. That's very good. In which case we can go back.
No, why not stay with your reversed order? Because I need to find the papers I've just left downstairs at this conference. So I will join you in 2 minutes, if that's all right.
That is brilliant. Thank you. We're very grateful to have you. In which case we'll resort to plan B, which is we'll take Cheryl and Matthew first and then come back to Tony. So delighted to have Cheryl, who's the managing director of EELGA, to address us first. Over to you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to join you today. This is such an important area of work for our member councils in the East of England. The East of England Local Government Association is the membership body for all 50 councils across our large geography, all different tiers of councils involved in that membership, and the issues presented in these two papers are really critical to them. We are all obviously heading towards the 17th of this month for the statement from the Chancellor, more of that later. But what we've presented for you here are two really helpful papers about finances for councils. And I'd firstly just, like to thank our colleagues at the University of Essex for their helpful work in producing one of these papers around the financial pressures overall that councils face. This has really showed us how comparatively our region is worse off than other areas in relation to that funding, and the challenges we face are now becoming really quite critical. The East of England LGA is working on an integrated policy agenda around financial sustainability, along with other policy areas such as sustainable growth and climate change. I just wanted to make that the point that this is not in isolation. This is about medium-term plans for places and people, which is absolutely what councils are all about. And our mission at EELGA is to help and support our councils to be the best that they can be for our people, places and communities. So our councils are currently setting budgets for next year. As you know, there are massive inflationary pressures facing councils, and depending on the size of council and the type of issues that they are dealing with, this can be gaps of millions to tens of millions for some of our larger councils. And these are now coming to the crunch point about difficult decisions to be made for next year. Councils have a statutory duty to balance their books, and they cannot borrow their way out of these issues. So there are some remodeling exercises going on right now in terms of where we will all be next year in each council, and what the impact will be and what the decisions will need to be to sustain critical services. Councils desperately need additional support from government and flexibilities to generate some of their own income, because not all of their financial position can be resolved by statutory and government grants. So I'd just like to highlight the report Income Generation for Councils. This was produced following engagement across all of our councils and has highlighted a number of key findings. The sector has responded to current financial challenges with a range of innovative income generation approaches. So these could include, for example, commercial property investments, traded services, fees and charges, or joint ventures with partners. So, for example, to deliver infrastructure projects. There are a number of challenges faced by councils in dealing with this, of course. The current economic environment is a very key part of this. With the inflationary pressures that there are, this makes actually the area of such as joint ventures with partners, capital projects, etc., much more challenging to achieve. There's fragmented grant funding that was mentioned in the introduction today. So, over 100 times different pots and grants that councils have to use to put together the jigsaw of their financial plans. And then we've had reductions in core support from central government over a period of time, of course, going back to austerity and perhaps beyond. So there is much that points to difficulties now for councils in balancing the books. And in terms of commercial activities, there are particular constraints and issues also. And the paper on commercial activities sets out some of these. So there are new restrictions on borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board. And there's a feeling amongst our councils that the new guidance around this has become a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And that actually we want to retain some flexibilities for councils that would help with this area going forward. And there's also a certain level of uncertainty around what is and is not permissible in the Public Works Loan Board arrangements in terms of borrowing. So I will just signpost you to the report, Income Generation for Councils, in the report from the University of Essex on the overall sustainability of finances for councils. And I'm going to hand over to Councillor Hicks now to take you through the recommendations arising from these reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'm here to represent the voice of councils actually in our region as chair of the East of England LGA. And I also welcome the APPG's focus on and support of local authorities in recent years. So thank you for that. I think it's fair to say that we're all deeply concerned about the financial sustainability of councils actually in the current economic climate. As Cheryl has just highlighted, we are now all in that budget setting period for next year, and the projections for future years has really identified, I think, for all of us, significant funding gaps and therefore risks. EELGA, like many, I'm sure, have written to the Chancellor, setting out our concerns and our priorities ahead of the autumn statement on the 17th. And we look forward, hopefully, to some positive news, although we'll just have to wait and see. But early suggestions do show a reduction in government spending, and that is for all of us, for all councils, a great concern, and therefore obviously the impact that will have particularly on our most vulnerable residents. We welcome the opportunity to raise the points actually in today's meeting, and actually I think it's important that we have this opportunity to provide a focus on appropriate income generation for our councils. Clearly going forward, what we would ask of government, sort of general recommendations really, are that there are no further reductions in funding to councils via the revenue support grant or other funding opportunities. Really important that we start seeing that multi-year funding settlement for councils to bring some sort of stability in the medium term. We need flexibility on council tax rates so that each council has that ability to mitigate against any further budgetary pressures in that way. And we need to see a continuing work, the programme of work to actually simplify, which has been mentioned before, but simplifying the funding landscape for local authorities. We want to maintain actually that continuing journey of devolving greater funding and powers into local authorities, and there's a lot of work still to be done there. Now, councils have increasingly relied on their ability to generate clearly their own income. And today we are launching, and we've all seen the EELGA's report on income generation for councils in the East of England. And this really does shine a light on how important the activity has become for many authorities in recent years. And there are many innovative approaches that have been taken, and it sets out recommendations on how this actually could be improved to really maximise those opportunities for councils, while also obviously importantly retaining the necessary scrutiny on the use of public funds. So in the report, there are some specific income generation recommendations. One is to move to a more nuanced approach in terms of monitoring and assessing the local authorities' trading activities, to offer greater local flexibilities in the latest PWLB guidance, to offer greater incentives for commercial activity that also supports actually local economic growth. We talk about turbocharging the UK Municipal Bonds Agency, and to provide support to councils that invest in the community wealth building. Central and local government to work together to revisit the general power of competence, as laid out in the report, to explore if this still is actually fit for purpose or whether it needs to be actually reconfigured. So the launch of the report today, we're pleased to launch it. Obviously, we look forward to a response from government on the recommendations within the report and any comments it wants to make in terms of appropriate income generation for councils. Clearly, it's really important that we strongly advocate for government to respond to and take account of actually our broader recommendations on council finances as we head into the 17th of November and we wait for that autumn statement. EELGA's political leaders and officers really would continue to welcome that opportunity to actually really engage with central government and the representatives to really try and reach some sort of satisfactory solution for what is a very, very challenging time for us all. Hand back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we could now go to Tony. Tony, can we hand you the floor? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for putting up with my travails. The thing is, I'm speaking at another event, and the only way of squeezing them both in was by getting to this one. And of course, it's a Spurs' excellent new stadium, but it took me some time to find my way to the main entrance and everything and get online. So too much detail. Anyway, thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. And I just think, to state an obvious, something obvious, we live in an amazing times, amazing at various levels. I mean, several once in a lifetime events have affected the UK within the last 14 years. And the events of the most recent period, which I'll say very little about because there are politicians in the room who know more about this than I do, have themselves been pretty remarkable. But as far as local government's position and the financing of local government is concerned, I think the first thing to note is that we are about to enter a period without parallel for many households, in which they're going to see a bigger decline in their net household income in the next year or two than in any equivalent period since the 50s when records began. So in terms of the demand on local government services, demand on government more generally, that I think is likely to increase inevitably because of this significant decline in household incomes. As far as local government finance is concerned, which I realise is the main focus for this APPG today, we are facing a radical change of gear. New Chancellor, new Prime Minister, and they have the challenge of getting Britain's books back into some kind of acceptable shape. And that means not borrowing too much and not building up debt too fast, because if we do, we now know it spooks the international market, financial markets, and we can't do that. America might be able to do it, we, the UK, can't. So we're going to see an increase in taxes, we're going to see a reduction in public spending, of which a moment. It is, of course, worth wondering whether the government is ever so slightly going high on the doom stakes at the moment, so that when the 17th of November announcements are made, we don't feel it's quite as bad as we were all led to believe. I mean, that's a bit cynical, but if I was them, I'd do that, to be honest. It's a personal view. But there will be a need to reduce public expenditure as part of the package of getting the national finances back into shape. And what does that mean? Well, for local government, we know from an excellent National Audit Office report published last year, local government revenue spending is still on average 15, 20, 25% lower than it was a decade ago. So whatever happens now starts from lower spending than a decade ago. And the equivalent figure for the NHS is 15% to 20% up. So that's the difference between the way NHS has been treated and local government's been treated. And having said that, there is no question that local government will find itself subject to further constraints. At best, flat real funding for the period 23, 24, 24, 25, 25, 26, possibly even flat cash, which would be very, very hard indeed. That would mean spending cuts in real terms, given inflation, of 3 or 4%, 5% a year. And we can't rule that out. I think financial planning will require that. I'm sorry, the conference is breaking, rather odd time for a coffee break. So I think local government will have to plan for further constraints and certainly no let up. And therefore the conversation we've just had is important, trying to find ways of maximizing revenue from fees and charges, being as efficient as possible will continue. I think local government definitely needs to lobby for fewer one-off grants. It's a theme in the paperwork for today. Dozens and dozens of small grant councils have to bid for, very, very time consuming. And we've actually seen a really interesting piece of research from UK and a Changing Europe think tank recently, showing that the public, what they really want is better local services, lower crime, better local services, rather than lots of one-off grants, trying to deliver levelling up that way. Local government will face a 1 year, probably another 1 year spending settlement, which is not good. We'll perhaps hear later on as to when that will come. And I foresee virtually no chance of a fair funding review going ahead, simply because you can't deliver a fair funding review or any change to the distribution until and unless there is more money overall in the system. So we're going to see a static position, not much redistribution from council to council, but a real possibility that revenue spending by local government will be squeezed yet again, which is why events like today and the documentation produced today is so important, because everybody else will be lobbying in the same way. So the East of England needs to get its voice across. Otherwise, there is a risk that other voices, other services will do better. And one final thought, as the noise level here massively further increases. I do think that the local government family in the East of England and beyond needs to keep hammering away at the idea that local government spending, particularly on the services people see outside their front doors, streets, street lighting, refuse collection, all these environmental services have faced deeper cuts even than the average in the last 10 to 12 years. And this is how most people judge the state. They don't judge it by spending on defence and foreign affairs, wonderful though those things may be, they judge it on what they can see around their own homes. So I do think it's absolutely essential that the local government family, including obviously all party groups, in this case in the East of England, make the case. Otherwise, there is a risk people will think, and this is a terrible problem for local government, because local government's very good at managing with lower resources. There's a slight suggestion that because they can manage, they can take ever further cuts, and that's not true. So I'll just finish there, but thank you very much. And I'll try and kill the noise now. Find somewhere a little bit quieter.
No, thank you, Tony. We're really grateful for you for joining us. Your views are always very well heard, very well taken, and very, very important points. So rather sobering, I have to say. I'm going to hand back to Peter to run the Q&A, and just again to thank all the three speakers for really, really good introductions. Peter.
Daniel, many thanks, and many thanks to Cheryl, Matthew and Tony for setting the scene so well. I'm looking for questions, virtual hands or in the chat box, but I don't see any yet. But I'll just make a couple of observations through questions, that that raised with me as those three excellent contributions. First of all, I think it's when we look at the cost of living, certainly in my own area in Suffolk, and Matthew leads the county council in Suffolk, is when the councils, very much off their own back, are taking a key lead in supporting people through this winter, and they've very much been proactive, getting measures in place, and I think that is a point that needs to be made to government. I also think in the East of England, and there's two issues that provide us, I think, with additional challenges. Firstly, we cover a relatively large geographical area, a dispersed population, and it can be difficult to provide services to our populations because of that. And linked to that, we do have a more elderly population than a lot of other regions, and that in itself puts enormous pressures on the care budget, which we know is one of the real challenges that councils face. So that's just a couple of observations that our speakers might just wish to comment and elaborate on.
I'd be happy, Peter, if I may. I mean, I completely agree. I think it's very, very hard. It always has been hard for any national need formula, and we're still living with rather old, out-of-date national need formulae anyway. They haven't been updated for the better part of a decade. And it's always very difficult to deal with areas that are not quite near the England norm. And so rural areas, I do think, where service levels are often way lower for start, from what is provided in larger towns and cities, there is a risk, of course, that incrementally reductions in local public services show up all the more obviously because the level of service, for reasons that are to some degree obvious, was lower in the first place. So I take that point entirely, and I always marvel the way councils, which are very good at this, manage to describe much lower levels of refuse collection as environmental and green improvements, which they can be. But I take your point entirely. I think for areas that never got very high levels of funding, incrementally reductions in spending will have a bigger effect, inevitably, mathematically.
Peter, if I can come in as well, if that's okay. Of course, I think COVID showed us what local authorities can achieve by working together. And in the pandemic, clearly two-tier areas had to work together and did work together very successfully, rolled up our sleeves, made minimal fuss and got on in delivering. And I'm sure that's really what's happening again now. I think the difference is before, to be fair, the government did fund us, did cover our costs. It was very clear. The message was very strong. Now, I think what we don't need is uncertainty about what the future may hold in terms of funding any issues that come up through the winter, and particularly through the cost of living pressures. So, we're working well together across, I'm sure, district, boroughs and two-tier areas, unitaries, rolling up our sleeves again. But I think that there needs to be some further clarity around the funding of all of that going forward.
Many thanks, Matthew and Cheryl.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the demography point. We saw in the latest census data that the East of England has got the largest increase in population relatively, 8.3%. So in terms of Tony's comments earlier about the needs of the sector and vulnerable people and the services people rely on in their community, we have this much larger population as well to be dealing with. So in terms of this fairer funding debate, which we know is, as Tony said, bit in the long grass again at the moment, we have a very strong message on that from the East of England that we need to continue to make. The rurality, the large geography and the large increase in population.
Many thanks, Cheryl.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I do think it's true that census is very revealing. There is a big population increase in the East of England, and of course within it, some places more than others. We tend to talk about spending in real terms as if there was no population increase. But if you look at spending in real terms per head, then of course the pressure's all the greater. It's obvious, but all of, well worth saying in parliamentary debates, if I can hint.
I will take that hint on board, Tony. Daniel.
Yes, sorry to abuse my position, but I feel I have to come in on that last point about the rising demographics, because it's been a source of constant frustration in Cambridgeshire. That the view is that actually the population is rising much more quickly than the official statistics have shown. And that pressure on local government services, but also on the health service, just is intense and inexorable. I just wonder whether Tony or any other panelists can give any recommendations as how we can kind of get across the government. I'm sure they don't want to hear it, but that this is a sort of a double blow for areas that were traditionally underfunded in the first place, but are actually facing rising pressures. And there's kind of economic argument here, because we are also one of the great contributors to the UK economy. So it's important that we go on doing that, but we can't do it if we haven't got the basic resources.
Tony.
Well, it is without question that the East of England is a contributor to the, is a net contributor to the UK economy. And given the government is now, I say this non-politically, all governments would be desperate for any economic growth they can get, then ensuring that the East of England, which is highly productive by European standards, British and European and global standards, gets the resources necessary to allow the economy to grow. And that does mean continued investment, because we may see cuts in investment, which I haven't talked about. There will be a need for better transport in particular. I know many parts of the East of England don't have great roads, or certainly unless you're to and from big towns, London, to and from London, not great system. So I think we need to also think about the need for continued investment in local infrastructure to allow the economy to grow. And of course, there may be reforms to the planning system, which got shelved and then put back on the shelf and then shelved again. So we need to keep an eye out for those as well.
Many thanks, Tony. Cheryl, do you want to come back in?
Yeah, it was just to signpost to a couple of key documents that support some of the discussion we've been having so far. Last year, we produced an economic prospectus for the region and an offer to government about the impact of the East of England and its contribution to the economy, but also what we need in terms of infrastructure and growth. And to build on that, we're working now on a report for December for the parliamentary reception for the region on levelling up. This is going to be a really data-rich, evidence-based report under the 12 themes of the levelling up policy, which will really give more evidence of the latest data on a number of the things that we've been talking about today. So building that narrative for the region, keeping those key points and the advocacy really strong around those key messages is very much top priority for us as we head into that parliamentary reception. Thank you.
Many thanks, Joel. And I'm looking for questions stroke observations from the floor? I'm not seeing any at the moment. Tony, if you want to come in. Yep, back in.
If there's a gap, only if there's a gap. I don't do.
Yes, please do.
I didn't fully address Daniel's point. I was going to put this in the chat. And I sort of hinted at this earlier. I think in terms of lobbying, and I don't need to say this to politicians nationally and locally, the extent to which people judge the whole of government by what they see outside their front doors and in the streets near their homes, I think is a very powerful idea. It can be so easy. I know nobody on this call will, but so easy to think, oh, well, streets and street lighting and graffiti and litter and all of this doesn't matter. Actually, it's the way most people judge most of government. And I think that, any government of any party would do itself an enormous amount of good. And we should always lobby, should we not, to help ministers and shadow ministers do things that make them popular. Huge amounts of good by just making everybody's streets seem a little bit better to live in. And, I just think we cannot overstress this point, especially given how little is spent on them compared with the £1 trillion, £1 trillion is spent across the UK or more now on all public spending. And I haven't got the numbers to hand, somebody will correct me. I guess on most of the services that we see just outside our front door, it will be a couple of billion out of that 1,000 billion maximum. So, I just think we need to keep telling ministers and shadow ministers it's in their own interest to make local areas look nice and help councils do that.
But that's a point very well made. I see Daniel wants to come back in, Daniel, and then Matthew may well have some observations from very much the coalface.
Well, just to say that is a point very well made, and I think that would be borne out by most of us, most politicians on this call. We get that point, but it's certainly worth reflecting back both to government and to leading shadow cabinet members. I was just going to move on to a slightly different point, which I'm not expecting perhaps huge sympathy from everyone on, but because Cambridge is generally seen as one of the more prosperous, successful parts of the region. But seeing the interest rise, which I think has just been confirmed, that we were all expecting, I have to say a huge number of my constituents are mortgaged up to the hilt in a very, very expensive city. They're also the kind of people that I've already referred to that are key to future economic prosperity, because some of them are from all over the world driving the science base that is part of the success story that is the Cambridge sub-region. And I'm genuinely worried, actually, in some cases, that we're going to see a new group of people who are really struggling, and inevitably they'll be looking for help and support. And I just wonder what local government can do to provide some help in those kind of situations, because the housing issues in a city like Cambridge are absolutely key to keeping the economy working, because we have a constant churn of people, and people cannot afford to either buy or rent, and rents, of course, are inextricably linked to mortgage prices as well. We just cannot have people being priced out of the city, because, again, bad for them, but also awful for our economic prospects. So I don't know whether anyone has given any thought to how we might provide at least advice, if not support, to this group of people who are going to be pretty worried, quite frankly.
Yeah, can I just add to that point? I think it's a point very well made. And when we look, one of our key areas of concern that's sort of grown, that is a new area probably, is those that have never actually sought help before. They've always just about managed. They've always got by. And they don't know where to turn for help. And this is the problem. They're not the people that have gone through and had support through the benefit system, or have through other means have had that ongoing support. And they're the group that probably are at risk of turning to inappropriate places to try and sort out their problems. They don't know about citizens' advice bureaus. They don't go down the traditional route. So we are putting quite a bit of effort into trying to get into that group, who have just about managed it and just about managed in the past, but now something will happen that actually has never happened before. And I echo your concerns. It's a growing area of concern as well.
Many, many thanks for that, Matthew. And I see we have got Councillor Judy Emanuel from Uttlesford District Council. Judy.
Good morning. Thank you for letting me speak. I just wanted to give a particular example. So I had to do an airport run this morning, drop my husband off at the airport. I live in a village within 10 miles of the airport. To get there, I had to drive through 3 floods. To get home, I had to drive through another very significant one, to the point, lorries were creating bow waves that were covering cars. It was really severely dangerous. Now, that road is the primary relief road for the M11. And you've just got to look at, the airport wants to expand. We want more business to come into this part of the region. It's really important that the airport is supported. But when you've got local authority funding, meaning that Essex Highways can't do any routine maintenance anymore because there's no money in the pot, they can only do firefighting, and they're just relying on who's shouting the loudest, essentially. And my village has been shouting loudly. So the north and south of our village, which were flooding routinely, are now not, but only because we've been having to jump up and down and make a huge noise about it. It just seems to me really short-sighted to reduce the funding to support the existing infrastructure that's not in great shape, at the same time as trying to add 17,000 additional houses into our district. It just seems to me that there's a real disconnect between those two components. You can't expect the existing infrastructure, which is already creaking, to cope with additional investment and additional growth. Thank you.
Many thanks for those observations. Any comments on that from our 3 panelists?
Well, I think all I'd say is, councils have had to adapt over many years. We have statutory duties, non-statutory duties. We continue to lobby government to fund us as they can. Of course, there's a bigger picture out there, a national picture. We're part of the bigger picture. We'll continue to lobby and do all we can to get appropriate funding, but the government has many demands on the same pot of money. And that filters down into, doesn't it, with the county councils with statutory and non-statutory duties. And unfortunately, the non-statutory duties have had the hardest time over the last few years.
Many thanks, Matthew. Tony?
Well, I mean, we all remember that in theory, Section 106 and the Community Infrastructure Levy were intended to provide, where there's new build, to provide the infrastructure, helps fund the infrastructure. And of course, the number of ways in which it's possible to spend. You can spend only £1 once, but it is easy to imagine spending these kind of revenues that come with planning and development more than once. Personally, and I've mentioned this at a conference I'm allowed to mention, the Southeast Councils I was at recently, I think it would be interesting if policymakers considered a levy on infrastructure utilities. I think they do an enormous amount of work on roads, which doesn't end very well for the roads. And for an interesting new way of raising some revenue, I sort of personally think some of the utilities might be a good source to help make good some of the potholes and so on that they leave in roads. And I know potholes are very important politically, but that's just a personal view.
Tony, that's an interesting suggestion, which I anticipate is certainly well worth exploring there. Now, Steve, our secretariat, has got his hand up. Is this, Steve, just to direct me to the chat box where we have got a couple of questions?
It was just, Peter, I was going to point out there are a few questions there, but which obviously you've seen. But I was also just going to mention to everybody that people have seen that we were hoping the minister would speak as well. Unfortunately, he was reshuffled out of the government, I think, Paul Scully, but also the new minister, though, has, or the office of the new minister, Lee Rowley, has indicated that he should be able to meet with the chairs of the APPG and the East of England LGA following this meeting. So just that bit of information, but yeah, back to you, Peter. Yeah, and as you say, there's questions in the chat now.
Many thanks for that, Stephen. I'll just, we have got a question, we've got 2 questions I can see in the chat straight away for Will Elliott, who makes the observation that planning services at district and borough level are really struggling at the moment, and he sees what is the view of increasing the fees for for planning applications to reflect the costs associated with processing them. I'm quite sure Matthew, although Suffolk are not, they do some planning applications, that will be something that they have looked at in terms of raising their own revenue. Matthew, any thoughts on that?
Yes, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that you can only charge fees to break even. You can't make so if the costs of running the planning service increase, as in the cost of staff, you can tweak it accordingly. But at the end of the day, you can't come out having made a profit through the planning process. Recruitment of planners is a very big problem. Planners are moving jobs very quickly. Each authorities are all competing for the same pot. And it is very difficult to hold on to planners for long periods for many authorities.
Many thanks for that, Matthew. If I can just, as I said, looking at the questions in the chat box, we've got James Palmer has Eastern Powerhouse has made an observation. James has asked, has any work been carried out on the potential for private investment in infrastructure in these? On the basis it seems highly unlikely as government is going to change direction, provide that extra money. As I said, we're looking at, I think, well, Tony suggested the levy on infrastructure utilities. James is has come up with another proposal for raising additional money on much needed infrastructure improvements, which can, increase the region's productivity. James, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit more? We can't hear you yet, James.
How about now?
We can now.
Ah,
yep.
Wonderful. Fantastic. I'm sorry about that. I'm struggling with technology that's beyond my comprehension. Anyway, so yes, it seems very clear to me that there are opportunities to bring funding into particularly the rail network. And it's also clear that government have looked elsewhere in the country when it comes to investment into rail. Now, we can talk a lot about why and how that is, but we also know the Department of Transport has a clear long-term plan for investment, and that long-term plan doesn't include the East of England. So I just wondered if any work had been done. We're certainly engaging with Network Rail, who are very concerned about the current situation. Has there any been work that's been carried out by the local government association or by Transport East of gaining private investment into the region? Because it seems, from my experience as mayor and from my experience in the Eastern Powerhouse, it seems that there are companies who want to invest into the East. They see it as an area of huge potential, and government simply are not seeing the huge potential here. So is anything being done around that as well, please?
I think that's an interesting. Tony has just left his place for a moment, but he has put an interesting observation in the chat room that his own personal perspective is the East of England. He thinks we do have a strong case to make investment in terms of for massive infrastructure investment. And it's gratifying, I think, from our perspective, to have his sort of insights and support on that particular issue. Any Matthew or Cheryl have any comments on James's sort of thoughts on that particular issue?
It's an interesting idea. I haven't heard that any direct piece of work's been done by Transport East along that. I'm sure they would have explored it or discussed it. It's something I'll take away. I don't know is the answer today. But Transport East, Kevin Bentley leads that, obviously, with Dan Porter as the MP. So it's certainly worth picking up with them.
Yep. And I'm pretty sure we have got an observation from Esme Ewell from Transport East. He does say the case for maintaining existing transport assets is something that they are pushing the Department for Transport, as well as increase major infrastructure and buses. And I'm pretty sure that I have got in my diary in the next couple of weeks, Transport East are coming up to Westminster, and it's certainly, I think, that particular issue they're going to be pushing on is the strategic approach to rail investment in rail infrastructure. Tony, you're back in your place, and it's something, you know, in the east of England, it does at times feel that we have been banging our head against a wall in terms of making the case for investment in infrastructure in the region. You know, I think all of us on this call, we look at Ely Junction and Hawley Junction on the, as far as the railways is concerned, we passionately believe there is a compelling case for that. We're yet, you know, we're still driving away on that, but we're yet to get the government to sort of really recognise that one. You've made the comment that you think there is a strong case for infrastructure investment in these. What else can we do you think, to get that message over?
Well, and I was just about, if you hadn't kindly invited me to look at the Treasury does produce each year spending per head figures for each region, for each service, which you get a public expenditure statistical analysis. And I was about to look at them, but I know without looking that the East of England and East Midlands tend to have really quite low spending by the standards of the rest of the UK. And I do think in a sense, the reason that I said earlier that everywhere, all areas have to lobby, we have a very top-down system in England within the UK in terms of controlling spending. And you know, the fact the government has very large commitments to High Speed 2. I mean, High Speed 2 is spending £100 million a week, every week, from now till 2040. Spent £5.2 billion last year. And that's mostly in a small corridor between Euston and Curzon Street, Euston in London and Curzon Street in Birmingham. So I do think the case for regions that tend to get overlooked, and I do honestly think, I've said this publicly, I'm not from the East Midlands. I think the East Midlands does very badly out of investment, and the East of England similarly. And at the moment, you know, I do think there's a very clear case to be made that investment is tilted in a west direction within England. And so that alone, I think, is a powerful case for MPs to get together and councils to get together and say, well, if, you know, we don't mind the West getting all of this, but you know, we have these priorities that would, for a tiny fraction of this and these amounts of money I'm talking about, radically improve the productivity, connectivity, the lives of people who live in the region.
Tony, many thanks for that guidance. And did Matthew or Cheryl want to come back on that particular issue at all?
I think the figures speak for themselves, don't they? And we need to keep doing what we can with our MPs and the whole of the East of England pulling together. I think sometimes the East of England is forgotten. We've said that in the past, and we just need to keep banging that drum.
Many thanks for that, Matthew. And looking at the chat room, we've got Dan, who says, what role does the private sector have to play in helping councils be financially resilient with respect to the skills gap, particularly where the private sector would like to partner with councils? And actually, my next meeting straight after this one is an update from my local Chamber of Commerce on the local strategic, the LSIPs on which they're putting together, which came out of the Skills Bill Act from earlier this year. But obviously we've just been speaking quite a lot on infrastructure. Skills is equally, if not more important. Any feedback from our speakers on the skills issue?
Well, I mean, I don't want to say too much, hog this. I mean, without skills, nothing. All the brouhaha we've had in recent years of levelling up places in the East of England in that debate, I'm afraid. Some on the coast have, but not many. You know, if there were one issue that one could magically improve within the UK, you know, the use of public resources, it would be for post-16 non-university education. The area where we've done badly for years, government of all parties accepted this. And it is the place where allowing people to train and retrain, education is for them, and actually I think universities work more with further education. The key to almost all problems of productivity challenge, but you know, we all see this year in, year out, and actually schools and universities with infinite more retention and skills than FE, he said weekly.
Tony, many thanks for that. I see Cheryl's got her hand up, and after that, I'll come on to Councillor Louise Pepper from Uttersford District Council. Cheryl.
Thanks very much. Yeah, a couple of things I just wanted to mention in relation to this. Interestingly, we held a round table yesterday at EELGA all about skills in the East of England economy. And a number of the discussions at that round table were about the join up between the private sector and the public sector. One particular thing that resonated with me, and it comes back to the overall problems that we have, not only with recruitment into key sectors, but the financial constraints on councils, was the opportunity to partner with others to deliver skills training, where we've got shrinking budgets in councils to do that, and then to target that training to areas where we need more skills and economic growth in key sectors, in key locations. So it's about joining up that view of place and actually making the best of the finances that we have between us to attract and upskill our people. But there's also another example around Stansted, I believe, that my colleague Adam's on the call, and I just wondered if he would touch on that just to add to this particular answer.
Of course, thanks, Cheryl. So yeah, just to make this issue a bit more real on the ground, I think some people may already be aware of this example, but at Stansted Airport, there's a really good partnership across the college, across the airport, the council and the local enterprise partnership, all to develop the skills provision desperately needed by that airport. So that's just one kind of real life example of where that partnership really does work. And I'm sure there's many others across the region. And as Cheryl said in our roundtable discussion on this earlier in the week, we explored a number of these and are definitely going to explore the opportunity for more in the future. So thanks for that.
Adam, many thanks for providing that additional information. I'll next come on to Councillor Pepper. Louise.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've actually written down a couple of things I'd like to express. United Nations says current emission pledges will lead to catastrophic climate breakdown. The government needs to set new goals and make deeper cuts to limit temperature rises to 1.5. Atmospheric levels of all three greenhouse gases have hit record highs. Scientists warn the world is heading in the wrong direction, amid rise in nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide and methane. Hammering cutting the so-called green crap has left the UK households highly exposed to soaring global gas prices and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Our district is fairly affluent, but the latest BIS data update in March 2020, and that's using the 2018 data, indicated that 9.3, that's 3,117 households in our district are living in fuel poverty. We have the highest listed buildings outside of London. Many households are on oil. Our council was very fortunate to secure 2 grants that totaled 1.2 million. The first scheme ended in July. We just, again, didn't have time to try and spend that money, but fortunately it's been combined under a single scheme called the Sustainable Warmth. However, we only have 6 months left for the funding to be spent. So we are obviously trying to target the most vulnerable and low income households. We have no idea what will happen when the scheme closes in March 2023, but currently any money not spent will go back to the government. There is a severe county shortage of green skills. I would actually like to see the government extend grants to a more realistic delivery. We desperately need more time to allocate retrofitting the most vulnerable members of society who are already struggling with food and fuel poverty. The government needs to understand it is not business as normal. We have a climate, energy and biodiversity crisis that should be focusing on the Climate Change Committee's recommendations. Their latest report was published in June 2022. We are morally and legally obligated to help the most vulnerable members of society and to meet our carbon commitments, which are enshrined in law. So that's the Climate Act of 2008. So that's really the message I want to, to be made extremely clear to our central government. We're very grateful for funding that we have secured, but there is a shortage of green skill set. And again, obviously, we just don't have the time, the time that's allocated for, spending this, all these grants just isn't long enough. So, we have a tremendous, I think everybody could admit, what challenge, I think that was the word I was trying to look for, but the challenge we actually have to meet, and this is a national challenge, is just, enormous. So I think that's really what I would really like to stress to the government. We absolutely have to do this. And, there's no other argument really, as far as I'm concerned, because I'm extremely concerned about my children's future. I'm extremely concerned about what's going to happen to nature as well. And that's really my bottom line, comment that I want to, make at this point.
Louise, many thanks for setting that out so passionately. I think you've brought back that, notwithstanding the immediate, we've got the cost of living challenge, but we mustn't forget that the climate change crisis is still there. And I think you probably highlighted the disadvantage of one of the disadvantages of the over-reliance on one-off grants. Have our speakers themselves got anything to say on the points that were made there?
Well, actually, EELGA has done some work. Cheryl, is it just worth touching on the piece of work that EELGA's actually been working on recently around the climate change, and because that's brought together a large number.
Very happy to do that. Thank you. So this is very timely. We've just completed a baseline study across our region of the progress on climate change priorities set out in the partnership plans of each county area. Retrofitting, you wouldn't be surprised, came up as a very key theme of that, along with biodiversity, along with a whole range of other themes, actually. So what we've done here is we've looked at how we can support councils and their partnerships to drive further progress collectively in these key areas. We have an action plan now around that, and we have a forum of lead politicians and lead officers from each county working to deliver against that action plan. So a good example of this would be, how do we get sustainable funding for retrofit that doesn't, go into the stop-start category that the councillor was describing there, because we have a huge number of homes to retrofit, both private homes and those that are stockholding councils have houses of their own stock to retrofit. And at the moment, we've got a small supply of funding that is stop-start that comes nowhere near the actual overall requirement. And given the links that have been made there to fuel poverty and the inflationary situation we're currently experiencing with that, this is very urgent. So yes, there is good collaboration, cross-party, cross-geography collaboration on that issue within our region. And we're very pleased that we managed to get this piece of work done in July this year, in readiness to really, motor on with that action plan as soon as possible. Thank you.
Can I also add, I hope you don't mind me, the other concern I've got is the future homes 2025. That's far too late. That would be another thing, if we could please focus on getting the government to amend that to a much earlier date, because now we've got 31, isn't it? We've got a law that came in that we can now demand 31%. And again, obviously, I've read headlines about, infrastructure and how much, the grid is going to obviously suffer from heat pumps, insulation of heat pumps. But obviously, if we can offset them with solar panels, that will help the grid infrastructure as well. So that's sort of the other argument. Sorry for butting in, but that was the other issue.
So, Louise, many thanks for coming back on that. And can I ask Tony for any his observations on the case you've made there so passionately?
Well, I mean, given the perfectly understandable preoccupation we all have with day-to-day stuff, and I'm guilty of this probably more than anybody, just getting basic council services delivered. It is always easy to neglect these bigger, long-term, sort of global climate type issues, and it's not that we're not interested. It's just that other things take the bandwidth. So, and I do think that the Russia's war on Ukraine, the consequences of that war, should be a good opportunity for Western countries, European, think long and hard about how we source energy, how that treats the environment. I think it's we didn't do this in the 70s when OPEC caused us such trouble. This time we must.
Many thanks for those observations, Tony. Just looking in the chat room, Rachel Hopkins MP has been with us, was with us quite a long time. She's had to unfortunately go to another meeting, but she has thanked everyone for what's been a very interesting and helpful briefing for her. And then Sandra Johnson has from Costains, she's also had to go, but she has very much said that they would be keen to engage and to work with councils about how business can collaborate on getting more funding for the region. And as I said, Tony has then put in the chat box some very helpful sort of figures on the public expenditure that we get in our region, which you know, we don't compare favorably on. Time is marching on. I will, I think I'm conscious that Prasant Shah did have his hand up for a moment. Prasant, did you want to come in with anything, or as our very much our final speaker, so to speak?
Well, I just wanted to touch on the point of skills development. I'm a kind of local entrepreneur in Cambridge, and we obviously we're pretty strong in skill development in the region in terms of the top universities, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to kind of engage people at the mid-level, and probably the people are less affluent in terms of inspiration, in terms of aspiration, and in terms of opportunity, having been born and brought up in the region. So I just want to say, in terms of skill development, Cambridge and the region is world known for its kind of science and technology base, but aside from the elite development, which I think is doing pretty well, there's an opportunity to engage the rest of the region in the success and the opportunity that Cambridge has to be world class. So whether it's technical skills, vocational skills, finance, or a whole bunch of skills, I think trying to understand what the region is particularly strong at, and then having an integrated strategy to making sure that we'd have a wider as possible development of the talent that exists in the Eastern region, I think is worth bringing to the fore.
Many thanks for that observation. Time is pressing on, but I see Richard Gapper has put his hand up. Richard's from my neck of the woods, so Richard, I will. You want to come in quickly for final word from the FSB?
Yeah, I'll be very quickly, Peter. Thank you. So yeah, just there's a few bits there. I'm passionate about skills and also about obviously the energy crisis that we've got at the moment. So there's just a couple of things I just want to pick up from. So I'm from the FSB. And there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of understanding around what the support will be from government with regards to the energy help. There's been plans announced, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of clarity around that yet. And there's a lot of small businesses out there that are concerned. I would like to see a little bit more of a drive towards green energies. There's no real grants out there other than a VAT relief on a lot of solar panel installations and stuff. So it seems as though microgeneration, gone back 6 years ago when there was a big drive from government for microgeneration, that almost seems to have taken a step back. We've got a big opportunity to push in that area, maybe a little bit of help towards small businesses, and or residential might be very advantageous. It would help it will help restrict our independence on fossil fuels and these hikes in prices. So that's what we would like to see.
Richard, many thanks for that. I think highlighting the importance of investment in skills, highlighting the opportunities that there are in the East for investment in the green economy and in renewable energy, and also the challenge that SMEs can face themselves in tapping into that support and funding. As I said, time is pressing on, and I was asked in the last 10 minutes just to give our three speakers, and also I think Daniel and I as the co-chairs, an opportunity to very quickly sum up. And if they can do that, I think what I would just say, it's we haven't got with the merry-go-round of ministers, we haven't got a minister with us this morning, but we will be, I think, writing to them, summarising what has come out of this meeting, in highlighting the vital importance of investment in local government, with the settlement coming up very quickly, highlighting the unique challenges that the East of England has. Now, Lee Rowley is the minister. I think we should be writing to him, but I think this is so important. It also does need to go to Michael Gove as the Secretary of State, because we do need to be firmly on his radar as well. So with that preface, if I can just ask our three speakers to sum up. Tony, if you could, you can give us an overview, be very helpful overview on the challenges the East of England faces. And I think what is interesting from my perspective, you've actually endorsed what we're saying from the coalface, which is heartening in one respect, and actually, but it reinforces the case. But Tony, you're summing up, please.
Well, first, thanks for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it, and I've been, as I was chattering away in the chat, as I can't stop myself doing it, events of this kind. I absolutely just want to endorse the point you've made about ministers, and indeed, shadow ministers. We're in, dare I say it, running up to the beginning of a pre-election period. I don't need to say that to the MPs here gathered, and indeed other politicians. That's when political parties need to set out their stall for the future. They need to be able to articulate what it is they offer to us all, for different parts of the country, but different individuals, but for all of us as well. I still think personally the UK is very well, as I've just put in the chat, is an attractive offer in the medium to long term. It's a stable country with all sorts of advantages. And so I think the events of this kind today are extremely important. So I do think talking to the ministers, and indeed shadow ministers, about the region's case in a non-political way. I've always thought Michael Gove was a politician who understands what policy is. He understands how to use a machine to deliver outcomes, and that's not true of all ministers. So I do think it's worth talking to him and to the new Minister of State, Lee Rowley. But as I said, as we run into the election period, other parties exist, and they must be treated in the same way. That would be enough from me, I think. They must be given, they will be coming up with policy too.
Tony, many thanks for that. And I'll then ask Cheryl to make her observations, and then Matthew.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'd say the East of England narrative is strong and is becoming more integrated and coordinated, which is helpful in the lobbying work that we are all undertaking. I think I'd also say, councils face a collision of increased demand and shrinking budgets, whilst the population at large is growing, and we're facing cost of living pressures, which we've even done analysis on the public sector workers in the local government workforce who will be faced with falling into, for the first time, hardship. So in terms of sustaining public services, there is an absolute read across into what's going on for public sector workers. So I think I would say that the conversation today has also taken an interesting lens and an important lens on climate change. So my final comment is that next week we have an APPG session focused on climate change as well. And we do, in the East of England, want to see sustainable growth. That means sustainable finances, and the link to climate change is one that we will be really pushing for in terms of what the East of England is facing, particularly on the coastline, in terms of what we can offer in green energy, but also in terms of the risks to our populations from the effects of climate change itself. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Sure, many thanks for that. And Matthew.
Thanks very much, Peter. Yes, we really just want to take us back to really that we are launching this report today, and the report on the income generation, which is so important for so many councils across the East of England. We do obviously look forward to hearing a response from government on those recommendations as we all look at appropriate income generation. And it is a growing area and an area that really needs greater clarity. But also, I think, echoing the discussions that we've heard from many people that have spoken today and from previous speakers, really around the importance of government actually thinking and taking into account around our broader needs and our recommendations around our finances. The coming years and the years are going to be very challenging, and we do need to keep pushing the argument for the East of England, and that's what we'll continue to do. So thank you to all those that have put the report together today and for all the work that's gone on in producing it. And we'll continue to bang the drum up to the 17th of November and beyond.
Matthew, many thanks for that. Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And thank you for everyone who's contributed today. And I think very helpful, particularly comments about the ongoing need to make the case for the East. I think that was the purpose of setting up this all-party group originally. And the fact that others can see the need for us to be making that case, I think vindicates the decision to do it. And I think it strengthens our hand in the negotiations and discussions we have with ministers. I suppose the things I take away from it are this ongoing issue of the extent to which local government is constantly having to go to government to bid competitively. I think that's something which has grown up over many years, and it's just fundamentally undermining to local government, it seems to me, and something we need to really look at again. But also the role of public-private partnerships, which is obviously, again, a theme that runs back many, many years. And I think in terms of international investment, certainly the Cambridge sub-region in particular is well placed to do better for the UK and for the region. And I was very struck by an event that Stansted held in Cambridge a few weeks ago, making this exact point, that if they can get the better routes to some of the important places where economic development could well be, or economic investment could be secured from, then that would be a huge benefit to us. And it would bring me to my final point, I guess, which is a slightly more political point than perhaps I'd normally make. But we are coming up to an election, as was pointed out. And I think both parties need to think about the relationship between national and local government. My party, Gordon Brown, is looking at the wider UK constitutional settlement. I've been trying to get across, and I know Rachel Hopkins has been trying to get across in his thinking, that shire counties and the areas like the East need to be considered carefully within that as well. Certainly when Brown was in government, I think there was quite an interesting discussion and debate, which perhaps has slightly got lost since, about that relationship between how national government achieves its goals working with local government. Because going back to the point that Tony was making, whatever national government wants to do in the end, it's almost always going to be delivered on the ground. So it's a hugely important relationship, but it ought to be one of mutual respect rather than national government telling local government what to do. And that has seemed to me throughout my entire political life, seemed to be too often the case. So if we can establish that relationship of equals and have a sensible discussion, regardless of political affiliation, I think we would be in a better place in general.
Daniel, thanks for that. And very, very quickly from me, just the final word. You're right, we must continue to bang the drum for the East. We do have enormous potential. The message to give to the government is, notwithstanding the challenges that we faced, if you invest in us, you will get a great return, a great dividend. We have particular challenges in the East, as we've heard, with regard to demography, rising populations, the nature, the age profile of our residents. I think we've also heard, which needs to be emphasized today, that the local government are not there sort of in Oliver style, sort of holding out their hand for more money. They're actually incredibly innovative and think with a lot of imagination, also proactive. They don't wait to be told by central government to step up to the plate. They do it themselves. They have a responsibility to the communities that they serve, and it's important to recognise that. And I think, as we've heard, that budgets are under enormous pressure. But I think, as Tony said, these are the budgets that people see on their front doors when they open those doors. And if they're not being delivered, it reflects very, very badly on us. And it is so important to everyone's everyday lives. So I think we've made that. Hopefully, we've made that case. The Secretariat, who I thank for overseeing this, Steve and his team for overseeing this session, will have picked up the salient points, and we will be getting those over to Michael Gove, to Lee Rowley over the next, what I think will be very important 10 days or so until we get to that mini budget. So on that note, Steve, unless you've got some final leaving instructions, trailers for next meetings and whatever, that's goodbye from me, and very many thanks to you all for contributing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, see you next Tuesday afternoon at 5 p.m.
That's great.
Room 5.
All the best.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.